So we're going to talk about how writing for an international audience is different from writing for a domestic audience. And the first part of it is the changing academic world, that it's much easier for people who are native speakers of English to publish in the leading international journals because most of them are published in English. But there's increasing pressure now in Asia for young scholars, middle-aged scholars as well, to publish in English. It's part of the university's efforts to raise their profiles. And as a result of that, people have to learn how to do it. If they want to make an academic career today, young Asian scholars have to learn how to write for a foreign audience. And so we want to offer some advice on how you write for a foreign audience and how you think about it. I mean, if you're writing for a domestic audience of your people in your own field, you know what they know, you know what the current issues are, you know what people are raising questions about, and so you know how to target your research so it fits in.
Well, in fact, you find that there are two sorts of dialogues going on, or two sorts of conversations going on. One sort is what you might call an international conversation. And this is people who are in all parts of the world, but are discussing a common topic. And then there's another one, which is a much more localized conversation, issues of concern to people within whatever country is involved, but maybe it's somewhat less concern to people outside.
So what we would like to do is give you some advice on how you overcome these problems. In some senses, the first problem, which I'm going to deal with, is the easier one. It's how you try to figure out what a foreign audience might know and what you need to add to make what you're talking about understandable or legible to them. This has to do with, for example, if you mention the places of provinces, briefly saying where they are. It means adding on just basically phrases or one sentence or something like that in various places to set the context so that somebody who is not familiar with the material can get a general idea.
Yeah. Fundamentally, you need to consider what your audience is. And if your audience is, what the audience will know. If your audience is local, they will know probably the geography. But also if your audience is strictly within your field, then they will have a better idea of the background of what you're saying. And of course, some journals are targeting people who have that kind of background. Other journals are targeting a more general audience. So you need to be focused on your material, but also on what your audience is and who you're trying to explain things to.
I mean, and a second problem is how, of course, you find what you might call a hook to bring in that audience, to get that audience interested. You know where the hooks are, where the points of interest, the hot topics are in your own country. How do you find them somewhere else? And Paul maybe has some advice on that?
Well, the fundamental thing comes back again to your audience. And some years ago, I published an article, not my article, but in a journal that I was editing, which had to do with making bricks. And actually in Southeast Asia, there are very often areas of a city that are called brickworks. And this is precisely where they would manufacture bricks to make buildings. So the question is, who's going to be interested in that? So there's a brickworks area in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, and this article was about that. And then it went on to say that a lot of the buildings that were built by the colonial rulers in the Malay Peninsula were made out of bricks from Kuala Lumpur. Now this is of interest to people in Malaysia, probably not of much interest outside of Malaysia. But on the other hand, you could turn that on its head, and you could say, bricks are a feature of colonial architecture. And if you write about building materials used in colonial architecture, you're writing for a much wider audience. And you can use your material about the specific case of the brickwork in Kuala Lumpur as an example of this broader theme. And a lot of what you want to do in writing an article is to find as big an audience as possible, given what you're trying to say.
One final thing we might say about this, when we think about writing in English for an international audience, people sometimes assume that what we're talking about is writing for people in the US, the UK, Australia, Canada, English-speaking countries. But that's hardly the limit of what we're talking about.
Well, frequently, people are doing research on somewhat local topics. So the problem that we're talking about partly is how do you reach a broader audience? But part of the point too is that that broader audience exists in Asia. Everywhere from East through Southeast Asia and near South Asia, English has become a lingua franca for scholars. And so there are many topics that are going to be of particular interest to people in an Asian context. I can give you a quick example of that. If you're looking at a farmer who is trying to survive planting rice on, say, 1 hectare, a couple of acres of land, this situation exists everywhere from Japan through Pakistan, all across Asia. It doesn't really exist much in North America. So if you're trying to talk about the economics of a farm family or how to get information about agriculture to somebody who has a very small piece of land, you fundamentally have a huge audience in Asia, not much of an audience in North America. And there are journals that are published in the West and primarily are looking for material for a North American audience. But for that kind of topic, what you really need is a journal that's published possibly in Asia, and certainly a journal that is reaching a big Asian audience.